Today's podcast is about light. See, there's all kinds of light. Sunlight gives us life, and other types of light, like UVC, can make us sick. Well, what about using light to heal from some of today's most common ailments, especially one focused on the brain? Today, we have the privilege of diving into the extraordinary world of transcranial photobiomodulation. This is the story of healing the brain with light with Dr. Michael Ellenburg. Dr. Ellenburg, so nice of you to join us from Alaska.
Great, thanks for having me.
You know, this big word we say, transcranial photobiomodulation, I think it sounds amazing. I love saying it. It makes me feel very smart, but it also confuses some people as to what in the world are we talking about? So let's try and get to the core. Maybe you could simplify it for us and explain what exactly is transcranial photobiomodulation.
Well, a big part of that word, if we take this transcranial off and stick with photobiomodulation, kind of goes like it's evolved to that being the term that we're trying to use today. I mean, when I got involved in laser therapy in the late 90s, we were still using words like cold laser and low level laser therapy. And so the biggest thing for people to understand is that we're using laser energy at a very low setting power wise that is biostimulatory versus someone was getting, say, surgery with a laser.
Yeah.
And the World Association for Laser Therapy and also NALT, which is North American Association for Laser Therapy, decided several years ago, hey, listen, guys, we need to come up with a term that kind of encompasses what we're doing with lasers at this lower level of energy. And so they come up with this photobiomodulation term because you could even look up transcranial older studies and they'll use low level laser therapy because you're using energy that is in the milliwatts versus, super high wattage. And, with transcranial, we're talking about literally shining light into the brain via passing through the skull itself. And it has to be a certain wavelength. We can't use, red laser will stay in the scalp, but infrared will penetrate and go in the brain. And we didn't know any of these things were possible until the early work by acupuncture research in the late 70s. Where they actually were using red laser on actual acupuncture points on the head. Mm-hmm. And from that, they're like, there's a lot more going on here than we think besides stimulating acupuncture points and affecting the brain. And somehow that morphs into infrared lasers not long afterwards. And we started seeing the effects in acupuncture. And it took a while until we really had some people put together devices that could treat, various parts of the brain, not just one little area or one little acupuncture point.
Yeah, it's really amazing that you look at something like light that we see all around us and we think that can penetrate the skull. We know how hard this noggin can be. and yet infrared, right, is that type of wavelength that goes. Now, how deep are we actually penetrating into the brain?
Well, a suggestion from the research is looking at about 1 to 4 centimeters.
Okay. And with that 1 to 4 centimeters, what's happening within the brain?
Well, and that's the fun part. So as these studies keep going forward and looking at what's taking place, I mean, the simple thing is that one, we know that our bodies can absorb light, and we came from light. And at what place we first begin with is looking at a level within the cell where your cell creates energy. And the battery of the cell called the mitochondria. And there are various, what we would call complexes that are in this mitochondrial membrane that can absorb various spectrums of light. And from that, we then went forward. What happens next? So it's not just about the mitochondria. Initially, we would kind of hang in our hat and say, well, we're enhancing the cellular energy at a cell level via the mitochondria, and therefore the processes within the cell will work better. That was kind of simple way of looking at things. Now, over the last 15 years of research, we're in a far different place because now we know that we're also affecting blood flow. So we can increase the blood flow throughout the brain, and that's going to lead to better oxygenation at the cellular level. And oxygen is also how our mitochondria, our batteries, our cells make energy. We also know that we're affecting the lymphatic system of the brain, or the lymphatic system is a more precise term we're using for the brain. So we're actually affecting the way the brain moves fluid around. And we could also add to that they also affect the way the brain is detoxifying. There's also some possibilities of increasing in people who have, say, vascular disease of the brain, and which can lead to dementia. People have had many strokes, people have had aneurysm would be a larger, bigger picture of a hemorrhagic stroke. We want to be able to, especially if it's ischemic, so lack of blood flow, and we would be able to increase the ability to grow new vessels. So something called angiogenesis is another thing that we're saying has been affected. And then also at a neural level within the brain there's two terms. One is synaptogenesis, one is neurogenesis. So you're actually able to enhance the neurons within the brain, maybe even help ones that have been damaged, say from traumatic brain injuries like a concussion or a stroke. And at the synapse level, where our neurons are communicating with each other on both sides, we can affect those synapses. I got one else about that. No, that's pretty much everybody that I know of. I mean, and here's the thing. I mean, if we've all been in medicine long enough and doing this, we don't really know a whole lot. And I think it's really important people understand that. I mean, I don't care if you're a naturopath or you're a brain surgeon, there is obviously, different specialties taking place there, but the reality is there's so much more that's unknown about how the body operates and how it works. And then we can toss on top of all this, how you use this type of science with frequencies.
That's right. Because that's a big part of it too. It's not just the lights itself, it's frequencies, which I want to jump into in a little bit. But you've been using this since 2002. It's been quite a bit. And there's a lot of research on this. I mean, I was at the ISLA conference in San Diego with Dr. Weber and yourself and heard all this. There's so much science about this going back to, decades ago, really, with photobiomodulation. There's so much out there that's so interesting. But from your clinical perspective, using it for 20 plus years now, what type of patients are you using and what are the results you're seeing?
Well, and as far as this long-term use of the laser, a lot of our laser use in our practice was topical use, to be honest with you. Back in the day when I was using a fairly decently powered low-level laser therapy in the late 90s and early 2000s, if we were treating stuff on the brain, we were more thinking about, hey, listen, we're looking about treating, a head injury. Because that's also affected the neck. So working more on the fascial level, how these things began with. And so initially saw a lot of soft tissue changes where you work on the back of someone's occiput, which is the backbone here of the cranium, and releasing that tension in the neck that had happened, say, from a car accident, or they'd had an accident in a pool where they hit their head on the bottom of the pool and those sort of things. And I'm also an acupuncturist. And so I have used, acupuncture itself specifically on the brain for many, many years in patients to treat, outside of, say, injuries, also things like anxiety or depression in these patients. And, the big caveat with, anxiety and depression is to make sure that we're looking at, what are some organic causes of those things first, just to make sure we're not missing anything. Because, just because someone's having depression doesn't mean putting a helmet on the head is going to change that right away. Maybe the situational things taking place, maybe they have low vitamin D. Maybe they have low thyroid function known as hypothyroidism. They could be low in B12. Or they could have actually had, a traumatic brain injury or a concussion. And those are kind of the big areas that I've seen very interesting work with, because my experience with using any type of laser on my head really started about, 9 years ago. I went to a conference on mental health, and it was integrative. And at this conference hall is this laser device for the head. And I was like, okay, what's this? I love lasers. So I walked over started talking to the gentleman, and it was, I tried it out because I was very curious and I'm real sensitive to things. And I walked away and I was like, okay, I knew something should take place. I just know what I would be experiencing. And I felt just more calm, and they were using a specific frequency on that particular device at the time I used it. And it was more like calming, and I wouldn't call it more like meditative. But the big things, getting back to your first question, I just want to give you the kind of background a little bit there, are TBIs, strokes, usually ischemic strokes. That means, lack of blood flow, not a hemorrhagic stroke, and mild to moderate dementia in patients. And we're often trying to do those things in our practice currently in the last 4 or 5 years in combination, where we can enhance the effect. And so one example of that we're using is we work with hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And so in that environment, the patients compress and breathe in oxygen at a high concentration where we can flood their plasma way beyond what the blood itself can normally carry. And once they come out of the chamber, we then have them come over to the other side of our clinic and use the helmet.
Mm.
One of the reasons that we're doing that is that oxygen from the photoscience and photobiology research can make the blood more photosensitive.
Mm-hmm.
Because laser itself, we're talking about photon energy is what we're talking. And the last part of laser is your exposure to radiation. But in this case, it's photon radiation, which is not the same thing as a CAT scan, of course, or a PET scan. But we can enhance those effects. And even, certain supplements could affect this as well, as long as they can cross the blood-brain barrier. Like you could give somebody, riboflavin would be a good choice. Riboflavin is going to be better for intravenous laser, but using methylene blue, for example, that is a pigment that can cross the blood-brain barrier and is much more photosensitive for infrared and red laser in this case.
Yeah. You mentioned something like a methylene blue, and you're using this in a clinical process for serious conditions of the brain, but let's even go to those that are trying to optimize. A lot of biohackers love their blue tongues and optimizing their brains. That combination, like you're saying, the combination hyperbaric with this, but that combination of methylene blue, of other things, and in an optimization way, would the helmet or a transcranial photobiomodulation help with that? Because we're talking like, hey, clinical process, it's helping heal the brain in different ways, the lymphatics flow. But what about the optimization of the brain?
I don't see why it would not. I mean,
right.
I myself, the first time I used some of this technology, wasn't really looking to heal anything.
Right.
Just kind of looking for an effect. What would I feel like? And it's almost like if there was, on computers we have now, but on TVs in the old days too, you have like a brightener. It's like you almost turn up the brightness is what I would say I experienced using it. And I've had a few experiences myself actually where I had some minor concussions where I did use it because I wasn't feeling myself. But outside of that, for optimizing the brain function, absolutely.
Yeah. No.
Question. I think it'd make a big difference.
I'm a big fan of it as well, just for that optimization process of the brain and cognitive function and everything like that. And really have enjoyed using it. Now, as far as safety of this, you're talking about light. People get a little bit scared because you're saying penetrating the skull, impacting the brain. These are all things that people fear a little bit about. What is the safety? Are there any side effects or precautions anyone should know about?
Well, everybody's different as far as patients and how things go. And I would, in our several years of working with this, there's only been a handful of patients where, typically I come from, kind of this idea of not more is better, but, I think people can handle this technology at a higher level of power. And so one of the helmets that we're using has, 4 different settings, from say 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100%. And I would say, a good 2/3 of individuals, would have no problem at starting using the technology at 100% of power. With that said, though, we do have people, we've had who had some severe brain injuries, not to the point where they're unable to walk, but severe enough that they're still suffering many years later, where we have to start out at a very low level on them. And even the amount of time, a typical would be a half hour, say for your first patient, where in these patients, we're talking about maybe 15 minutes. Or letting them, I say, we're going to start this treatment. And if you feel anything negative, like at any point in time, let us know. We're going to stop, and find our way to, ease a patient into this. So I would say more sensitivity, but with that said, when we've had to stop a few treatments on some patients, I haven't seen anything perpetuate something going forward where it caused a problem for the patient. We stopped the treatment, what they were experiencing went away. And that was the end of them for that day, for that treatment.
Right. It was more of an acute reaction sort of thing. Blood flow, something happening there. Yeah.
Seen nothing lingering.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it can't happen because I don't like absolutes.
Sure.
Because they don't. And they can certainly happen. But the large studies they've done, like looking at big groups of people treated, the side effect profile is extremely, extremely low. So it's a very, very safe treatment. And the biggest thing too with this, we're using infrared light. And with that said, people need to realize if you buy one of these devices, you're not going to sit and stare at it.
Yes.
Because it's not good for your eyes.
No. And you don't see that light,
You can't see it. You can barely see it.
Yes.
And it can be strong.
Yeah.
So that's probably the biggest concern is people harming their eyes. And the way these devices are made, you're not having it, it's not covering your eyes. It's, up and above, or it's on a, it's a different setup where it's on the head. But,
Yes.
those are things that people need to consider. And, clearly, and you can even wear glasses that can protect your eyes from infrared light,
Hmm.
with on a regular basis. That would be smart. But with the helmets, it's pretty encased. So I'd say it's very safe.
Yeah, no, it's the bike helmet thing. You'd have to be completely wearing it wrong for it to be shining your eyes
Right.
or attempting to do that. And it was the interesting case because you're not going to see, it's going to look like a dull light almost with these diodes, or, on the Weber and different, of course, ones. But I never knew this till I was at the ISLA conference, that if you take a picture with a phone, it picks up, right? It
Oh, yeah.
sees the infrared that we don't, our eyes do. So you see all these shining, diodes, and the real infrared light looks like a purple one there. When you talk about things like depression, our normal conventional approach to that is antidepressants, it's SSRIs. Wouldn't you say, and I know there's a million other things, lifestyle improvements, everything like that, but for some people that maybe don't want to turn to that first, wouldn't this be a suitable alternative before starting on something that is quite impactful and has a lot of side effects, like an SSRI, which most people get hooked on?
Yeah, I would. I mean, again, I would just make sure, kind of our baseline, make sure there's no organic that's taking place that the patient's deficient in or having low thyroid function. But absolutely. I mean, and even before there was the use of the lasers, there's been a lot of work with, I know it's not the same topic, but just to bring it up,
Mhm.
is the use of magnetic therapy.
Mm,
There are centers now that offer, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS for short,
yeah.
for a variety of things. And they'll even have people come in and do like 20 or 40 sessions for depression.
Yes.
And I, certainly think these directions of treating the brain directly, especially with the light, would be a great place to start with before you decide to get on, an antidepressant, because it can be very hard to get off antidepressants
Hmm.
for
Incredibly
patients.
hard. Yeah.
And then certainly there are situations where they may need to be on them right away,
Mhm.
whatever that might be, because that needs to be done at that moment in time. Someone's, child, may have died, something very traumatic for a parent, or for themselves in general, or a spouse, or whatever it is, that at that time is needed at the point in time, just to kind of get them over the hump. But I think, this is for the most part, other than a few cases I mentioned earlier, a very gentle therapy,
Hmm.
and
And
nourishing, so.
oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. It's kind of a starting point in many ways that many people should look at, because it is so gentle, because it is so kind of subtle, and it's using light. So it's I think a phenomenal starting point that more people should look at. And this idea even of the lymphatic system, right? Something that's a
Yeah.
lot of people haven't heard of. We know of
Yeah.
lymphatic system, often overlooked as well, I would say, in the detox process and
Oh, absolutely.
drainage, right? But your brain has this as well. And we know there are a lot of neurotoxins out there, heavy metals, other things like that. If someone does find themselves in a state of, and maybe lab analysis has shown that they have high mercury levels, other things like that, and has brain fog, is this something you recommended to patients with heavy metal toxicity?
Yeah, as long as we're going to work also doing chelation to help pull the
Absolutely.
metal out of them.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean, and I've used it in a number of patients. So I see a lot of cancer patients,
Hmm.
and then a lot of them end up doing chemotherapy, and chemo brain is a real thing. I mean, there's no question about it in these patients, and we've even used it for that.
Hmm.
So, and I think even someone who's been under, say, drug abuse, you know, um, for some time, as a way of getting the brain, back into the action. And I think the fact that we can increase lymphatic circulation in the brain with the laser therapy help detoxify the brain from those things
Mm.
as well. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those things we don't really think about, detoxifying the brain,
yeah,
when
with the,
absolutely, I mean, a neurotoxin will go for the brain in a sense,
yeah,
impact it the most. So that's
absolutely.
where we need to do a lot of work. And we're kind of missing that in just focusing on, let's say, normal detoxification processes. But, another fascinating thing you did bring up before I want to bring up is this idea of frequencies.
Mhm.
Is there are different frequencies. So you have the light itself, but you have also frequency basically going on there that could be anywhere from 0 to, I think, thousands of different
Yeah.
hertz.
I mean, there's a wide variety of them. I mean, the big ones for the brain in general are, as we have a delta, we have theta, beta, alpha, and gamma. Uh, Delta, just for simplification of where those things fall, and delta and theta are more involved with sleep,
Mhm.
Alpha and beta and gamma are more involved in why we're awake. Alpha is more involved in more of a meditative, kind of being present kind of state, where the beta and gamma are really the ones where we're doing our work.
Mhm.
And so we'll often with patients do, and there is no right or wrong. Well, I don't know what I'd say wrong, but I mean we don't know, but we can mess around with how we're doing this, and we're often now we're switching between. And I got it from another one of the inventors of the laser technology, because they had an alpha and a gamma unit
Mhm.
that the unit itself attached to a
I
box to
see.
put out alpha waves.
Right.
And so we started saying, well, if they're doing that, then why don't we try doing that with the helmet here, and switching over. And so alpha, roughly around 10 hertz, just to get a certain number, and gamma more like 40. It can be a little less than that, and switching those up. But then beyond the brain waves, we have a whole spectrum of frequencies. I mean, there's even a pretty famous acupuncturist. He's a German, Dr. Bohr, who has all these different frequencies he actually will use on acupuncture needles on patients during treatments, on other parts of the body, not just the brain. So we've got, I think, a long ways to go in trying to, pick all these different frequencies that might exist that could help the brain outside of even the ones that normally exist in our brainwave patterns, for affecting the health and improving healing.
Yeah. There are so many, again, unknowns when you talk about the complexity of the brain and what we're finding out, even though there's so much research, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Yeah.
I mean, we have
It
neurosurgeons and brain surgeons. I mean, they're doing some phenomenal work. But the deeper areas of the brain, where does thought and the mind live at? Is it out around us?
yeah.
All of us
Have
together.
have you noticed any new notable research, like, coming out on transcranial photobiomodulation that got you excited about something new that you're using it on?
Not particularly at the moment.
Yeah.
Uh, back in March, I did a deep dive again in a lot of the research for my talk, just to kind of prevent, if I could find some newer studies and things that I hadn't come across yet. But a lot of focus has been on, the big topics we talked about, depression, anxiety, and in a big area we're looking at, of course, is neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's.
Yes.
And I think that's an area where we're going to see probably a lot more work coming, because in general, in medicine, even any kind of integrated medicine, there are not a lot of options for these patients.
Mhm.
There's certainly a variety of supplements. There's a variety of things to make sure that if they're missing something, to help correct that. But, we're having dementia happen at a rate that doesn't really match the aging population. A lot of times they'll talk about, say, well, we have more now because we're getting older. Well, the reality is, the death rate at birth has changed dramatically.
Yes.
And you average in some child who's only 2 days old with somebody who lived to be 85, you have an average. And that has changed dramatically in the last 60 or 70 years. So yes, we have an aging population, but we're not living, massively longer than we say we were in 1900.
Right.
There are still things, we're still dying from a number of diseases, but our biggest thing, getting back to mention earlier, is this neurotoxicity.
Mhm.
And the amount of chemicals that we're exposed to is tremendous.
Yeah.
And our means of detoxifying between person to person are very, very different. And it's not easy to, run some blood test. It says, okay, well, you do it this way, you do it that way, and figure that out. And this is not taught in medical school.
Right.
In your standard situation, if a medical doctor wants to get involved in environmental health, through standard means, they're an occupational doctor. And that's
Yes.
a MAC program after medical school.
Yeah.
I have a background in environmental occupational health.
Mm.
So I get exposed to toxicity very early on before I became a naturopath.
Mm.
And of course, we were looking at people working in industrial areas and that sort of thing, and working in factories. But it played out, and later on, that, hey, this is a big deal for all of us.
Yep.
And I think if we can, it'd be nice to see some more time spent in transcranial photomodulation, looking at this neurotoxicity and detoxifying the brain via lymphatics, or however else we can do that.
Yeah. I would be really interested to see how it impacts children, autism,
Yeah.
ADHD, things that you can connect to some neurotoxicity. maybe there's not 100%, correlation, of course. But you got to look at the amount of toxins that children are being exposed to from now and the past. And maybe that is the
And where their
rise.
parents came from, right? And
Yeah.
where their parents were exposed to. I mean,
Exactly. You pass
there was
it down.
absolutely. I mean, the Environmental Working Group did a study several years ago looking at called the Human Toxinome Project, and they had an average of 118 chemicals found in umbilical cord blood in babies when they were born.
Yeah.
How are those interplaying? What are those doing for the development of that child?
Exactly. And it's pervasive. It's not just conventional medicine. I've seen dietitians say that, this idea of detox is just a fad, that we all can detox. And it's wild to think like, hey, we've introduced so many chemicals, so many things into our water, into our food, into everything. And we're going to call this a fad, this idea that there's too many toxins and our bodies can't handle it, when we're obviously, you could do blood panels and see how many toxins are within us. So it's kind of strange to kind of push back against this idea of detoxification being a buzzword that people use when we need it more than ever. Everyone needs to detox these days. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Everybody should consider at least intermittent fasting at time, where you're eating for a certain time period in a day. I have a lot of patients that have a hard time with me telling them, hey, take the whole day, don't eat. They're like, oh, wow. Like, I'm not sure I can do that. It's like, well, you ever had the flu? You ever been sick and eat for an entire day? They're like, well, that's happened. I said, well, you didn't die. Animals, classic example. Many animals will not eat when they're sick.
Absolutely.
And when you're fighting an infection, you can also enhance your ability of your body to fight infections with autophagy, it's called. And so you can enhance your immune system function, which is another thing that a lot of people have a hard time to believe, that you can enhance your immune system function.
Yes.
By taking, say, supplements or doing a certain therapy of some kind, or even IV therapies. These are real things that can happen.
Yeah. Looking at where this is going, do you see conventional medicine embracing this at all? Because it is technology driven. I understand if this was a homeopathic, most of conventional medicine would laugh. But because it's technology, because there's a lot of research around this, like good research, do you see it as something that possibly, along with the drugs they're going to give for Parkinson and develop more and more dementia, all these things, as an adjunct that they would accept as something to utilize?
I would hope. The fact that it's lasers, and
yes,
lasers have been involved in medicine for a long time. And so for a lot of, standard docs, it's not too hard to get involved. The fact of using the lasers, that they're just not used to hearing about it at a stimulatory level. Back to that word photobiomodulation, we're modifying the biology of the cell, with photon energy, but at a very nice stimulatory level, not at a heavy-handed. And the biggest problem is going to be getting insurance, to accept something like this. I mentioned earlier transcranial, magnetic stimulation, TMS. That has taken off in some places because insurance will pay for it. And I've heard from plenty of doctors over the years, well, if I could get insurance to pay for it, I would have that in my practice.
Yes.
And that's our hardest part. And,
yeah,
I talked to a neurodevelopmental neurologist recently, and I said, have you heard of this therapy? She's like, yeah, I've heard of it. I was like, well, do you use it? She says, no, we don't. I was like, is there a reason why? She says, well, we need more research. So I said, okay, well, there's a lot on it, actually. If you go look, go to PubMed.gov, National Library of Medicine, and put in transcranial photobiomodulation, you're going to find hundreds of abstract summaries.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm optimistic, at least with this therapy.
Yeah.
It is lasers, and they'll have to come up with, certain companies that they're going to have to vet, that it be a certain, way of how it's being done. Evidence-based medicine studies, that old story is not really working out so well for medicine.
No, it's been a long time. We're sicker than
a long time. It's the same thing. And it's, it's profit driven. And if it wasn't profit driven, it'd be a far different situation. But I would hope in time that this will be involved. And the hardest part is educating the providers. They realize that, yes, infrared light can go through the bone on your head.
Yes.
You're crazy. And until people can realize that, I've given this lecture to a lot of people, and people come and talk to me afterwards like, this can really work. And I'm like, it can. It really can. I know it's hard to believe.
Yep.
I'll have patients. Sometimes when you don't charge for things, people are like, well, that doesn't mean it's worth anything. But we don't charge for the therapy in our practice. Because I really want to encourage somebody to try it. Like, hey, try this out. Let me know how you feel. you can feel any difference. I said, I said, everybody's different and how they experience things, but, versus saying, hey, it's going to cost you $10 to use this helmet, you know, and usually they're here doing something else anyways,
Yes.
or, doing a therapy. I'm like, hey, listen, and we've talked about the rest of their health problems. Like you might benefit from trying this helmet out, look into it, try it out. Said if it helps you, you can look in, you're looking at purchasing some type of like that for your family if it's something you want to do for yourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something you could do with
Try
like
make it available so they can come use it. So
yeah, something you could do with like the laser watch kind of thing that Weber does also, and you
Absolutely.
just throw it on someone while they're getting an IV or in there somewhere, and that could absolutely help, stimulate some things. For the people that do end up taking it home with them, do you recommend an everyday use of 30 minutes or so?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least initially. Once they've done it for a few weeks, then they can certainly go down to more of a maintenance, depending on what's going on, and
Yes.
how acute or how chronic something actually is. Clearly, if they had a recent head injury, that's, mild. And that's the thing. People think that you got to get knocked out to have a head injury. You don't,
Mm-hmm.
you can whack your head under your deck, clean it under your deck on a weekend. That's a head injury. And that could have impact on you. So, something like that, you want to use it acutely. I would say for some people, as long as they're not experiencing anything negative, up to an hour a day, it could be a good thing. Yeah. And obviously you have an issue with hair on the head, but it can go through it. If you're bald, you're the best person out there because it's going to penetrate the best, so.
That's the positive of baldness. The first positive I've ever heard.
Yeah.
As far as the synergies, you mentioned a hyperbaric chamber, right? And I do know a lot of people like, there are clinics now that really focus on head injuries, and a hyperbaric chamber is the only option, not synergizing it too much with other things. Aside from that, or looking at that, is there any other synergies you're noticing with other therapies? More specific, I would say, to those head injuries that I know hyperbaric chambers work so well on.
Well, I've seen some interesting before we were using a lot of the helmet and is working with the IV laser itself.
Yeah.
And I think, and as far as brain inflammation, which could fall into not just head injuries, it could fall into people dealing with, different types of dementias, that the combination can be a benefit where we look at in certain wavelengths of light with the blood, have more anti-inflammatory effects. So working on colors such as, yellow and blue intravenously and green. And we now know that through our work through Dr. Bansal in his group over in India, that IV laser can also stimulate the stem cell activity and then release stem cells from the bone marrow. So one interesting way too is stem cells can go everywhere. Is that if you stimulate a certain area, like you can almost in a way direct stem cells to certain areas of the body with laser therapy.
That's right. Yeah.
So say a patient has, some type of a brain issue and you were giving them stem cells and let me back up. Using the IV lasers, let's put stem cells aside, just IV lasers to get their own stem cells to their own thing. And using that laser while they're getting that treatment, you could possibly be directing stem cells to the brain.
Right.
If there's an injury.
It's almost like information and guidance system in a sense. Because
them.
stem cells don't, they're remarkable, but they don't have that kind of direction. They're just sort of all encompassing.
They're there.
Right.
Yeah. And you can direct them. And that is something that some of the research has been done. You can actually, it can happen.
Yeah.
So I think the IV laser system with the helmet's been an interesting way. I would mention the hyperbaric. I do a lot of ozone therapy with the blood.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly with that therapy, you're putting in a fair amount of oxygen into the body via the actual treatment. And then beyond the fact that the ozone can affect the way your hemoglobin binds with oxygen, so you're better delivering oxygen to tissues. That'd be a great therapy to be done after, a major autohemotherapy treatment or blood ozone treatment as well. And I would also add on top of that, IV hydrogen peroxide.
H2O2. Yeah.
Which IV wise, you have to be careful with patients because it can make their veins go away, which we don't like that.
Yes.
But
yes.
Those are the therapies I think that could be a synergistic effect to take place.
Yeah. But that's the great thing. It's such a simple thing to just throw this on your head, right? With the helmet and everything. And you get the synergies going, and that's it. And it's simple, it's safe, it's effective, no pain, no anything really there. And you're working on something that's actually stimulating your brain while you just sit there.
Yeah.
Really remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you
Mm.
see for the future of this beyond the synergies? Is this something you see that the technology advances, or does it just become more accepted?
Maybe a little bit of both. As far as I don't know how far we got to go further as far as like the power output of these devices. I
Mm.
think we're in a pretty good place.
Mhm.
Um, I think figuring out if there's a better way of giving the therapy with the frequencies
Yes.
will be something that will probably change the science of it, I believe, as that work progresses, however it does progress. Um, but I think in that direction, we'll see some different work with that. I think again, the power I think is enough at this point in time. Um,
Mhm.
and you know, some original technology looked at stimulating just certain parts of the brain, and maybe there's something to that, versus stimulating the entire part of the brain. Or maybe a way where these helmets are created where, we're going to focus on the occipital lobe today. And the way the helmet's made, you can put in your setup and be able to treat just that part of the brain
Yes.
and not the rest of the brain. That would be interesting, especially somebody that's
Super
had an
cool.
injury, to the optic chiasm in the back and, the vision issues possibly. So I think there'll be more of that going on, and acceptance is certainly the case. And,
Yeah.
you know, it'd be nice to end up at a psychiatry conference. People are talking about laser therapy for the brain, or what else can we use besides drugs?
Yes.
And at least there is a group called Integrative Medicine for Mental Health. I go to the conferences. I don't have any affiliation with them whatsoever, but I like them.
Mhm.
And, I ran into this technology because of them. They want to provide, other things to consider besides taking prescription drugs. And of course, there's our time when drugs are needed. I understand that, but
Yeah.
often they're not, and people don't know what else is out there.
No. And that's the thing. I mean, we have this growing concern in this growing population that are dealing with
Yeah.
things that impact the brain, whether that is depression, anxiety, or more forgetfulness, dementia, all these other neurodegenerative diseases. And we got to find better solutions because the
We do.
drugs are just not doing it. If they did it, we'd be healthier, but we're not.
And yeah,
Yeah, and more toxins. So, hey, Dr. Ellenburg, thank you so much. Where can people learn more about you? I know you have a YouTube, your practice website, share
yeah,
that.
our website is drellenburg.com, and it's
Mhm.
Ellenburg with a U on the end, Ellenburg. And we've got I think a pretty good setup on there for talking about the laser systems
Mhm.
and also for barracks. So you can learn more about that. Um,
Yeah.
and then, we have it obviously through ISLA, and I work with
Yep.
with the great folks of ISLA in the conferences, and sometimes those things will end up on YouTube, which is great. People can listen to those places as well.
Yeah, awesome. No, we'll link to those as well. Thank you again so much, and, yeah, enjoy your time in Alaska. Next time I'm up there, let's do a little fishing.
Absolutely. Meet up for sure.
I love it there. Yeah, enjoy. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you.
As you've heard today, perhaps antidepressant and drugs shouldn't be our first resort, and instead we turn to something much simpler and safe, like light, specifically transcranial photobiomodulation. Be sure to check out Dr. Ellenberg's work at his website, YouTube channel, and if you're curious on how to utilize this technology for yourself, go to our website where we'll post information on this podcast page about the Weber infrared helmet and other methods of transcranial photobiomodulation. Until next time, keep writing your own healing story.